From a story of a mysterious dog, a motel, sewers, and more, this lineup has a wide variety of stories that'll definitely be hard to forget. A huge thank you to tonight's writers. Remember to send in your story if you'd like to have it featured. Stories can be submitted to my subreddit r/SlimberReads. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. As the movers unloaded the final few boxes from the truck, I fantasized about the newfound peace and quiet awaiting me inside the house. The months leading up to that moment had been a non-stop rush of packing, fretting, yelling, a little crying, and more packing. You'd think with all the chaos involved that I was moving a small army, but no, it was just me. I had to keep reminding myself how much better things would get once I was settled in. After all, I got a good deal on the property. It was bigger than the other listings I had viewed. Once the last of my stuff was situated in my new home, I made a beeline for the couch. I didn't care if there was more work to do. I really needed a break. There were a couple boxes piled up in front of the couch, but I just shoved them aside. I fluffed up a pillow and positioned it against the armrest, kicked off my shoes, and heard a knock at the door. Shit. I begrudgingly made my way back to the front of the house, wondering if the movers had forgotten something. I looked through the peephole and instead saw a shorter, balding, middle-aged man. With a sigh, I opened the door and greeted the man. He introduced himself as Frank, and although he was struggling to balance several bags in his armpits, he awkwardly reached his hand out for a shake. I obliged and told him my name was Dave. "Nice to meet you, Dave," he said cheerily. "I live just a few doors down, and I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." Well, he was certainly efficient, even if a little intrusive. I thanked him and told him I would have invited him inside for drinks, but the kitchen wasn't set up yet. Frank didn't seem to take the hint. With a huge grin, he informed me that the bags were for me. He said I should consider them a housewarming gift. Frank then proceeded to reveal the contents of the bags. 2 dog bowls and several bags of dog food. "Oh, thanks," I said, forcing a smile of my own. "But I don't actually have a dog." Frank was quick to respond. "Oh, no, I know. These are for Shadow." He must have seen the confusion on my face because he went on to explain. Apparently, Shadow was a local stray that went from door to door around the neighborhood begging for food. The residents got accustomed to him, and everyone just started leaving food and water out on their front porch. This struck me as a bit odd, but I didn't feel like questioning it at the time. I thanked Frank again, and he turned to go. He started to take a few steps but then stopped, his back still facing me. "Dave," Frank said in a much more serious tone, "if Shadow pays you a visit after sunset, do not under any circumstances open the front door." Frank's cryptic warning kept replaying in my mind as I tried to relax. I couldn't understand why he had given me such strange instructions. If this dog was dangerous, why did everyone feed it? Why didn't anyone call animal control? Why did I only have to keep the door shut after nightfall? I wondered what kind of dog Shadow was, and why Frank's first instinct was to supply me with bowls of food for him. For a stray dog, Shadow seemed to take a high level of priority in his life. My questions didn't go unanswered for long. I only had to wait 2 days before the mysterious canine made his way up to my front porch. It was late afternoon, and I was still busy unpacking when I heard the distinct patter made by paws on wood. I stealthily walked to the front door and took a cautious peek out the window. There he was, lapping up water from the bowl Frank left me. Shadow didn't strike me as a very intimidating dog. He was a border collie with a white and black fur coat. I knew they could be an excitable breed, but Shadow held a calm, still stance as he drank from the bowl. He must have sensed my presence because he abruptly stopped drinking and lifted his head. He turned to meet my gaze. I'd never seen a dog act like this before. He didn't bark or wag his tail. He didn't bare his teeth at me or growl. He just silently stared at me through the window. I began to feel uneasy, and that's when I noticed his neck. Despite the fact that Frank had told me he was a stray, Shadow was wearing a faded blue collar. I was confused. Why would Frank lie to me about that? I tried to read the name of the dog tag, but I needed to get closer to see it. I glanced up at the sky. The sun was still well above the horizon, and Frank's word had already proven to be less than truthful. I decided that Shadow seemed harmless enough, so I opened the front door to get a closer look. I approached Shadow slowly, holding my hand out for him to sniff. Shadow just continued to stare at me motionless. I knelt down and patted his head with one hand, and reached for his collar with the other. Still no reaction. There were only two things listed on Shadow's tag, his name and an address. I felt a chill run down my spine. It took me a second to realize it, but the address was mine. I was thoroughly confused at this point. Did Shadow used to live here? Again, why would Frank keep this information from me? Up close, I could see that Shadow's fur was pretty dirty, and he had a couple of bald patches around his legs. If he did have an owner, he wasn't being well cared for. I thought about it for a minute and decided I should call animal control to see if anyone had reported a missing dog. I walked back inside and grabbed my phone. I looked up the number for animal control and gave them a call. A female operator answered on the other line. Animal Protective Services, how can we help you? Hi, I responded. I just wanted to report a lost dog. No problem. Does the animal have any identifying markings? Yeah, he has a collar. It says his name is Shadow. There's an address listed too, but it can't be right because it's the house I just moved into. I was wondering if maybe the previous owners were looking for him. Have you received any missing reports lately? There was dead silence on the other end. Hello? I asked after several seconds without a response. When the operator's response finally came, she was curt and she spoke quickly. I'm sorry, sir, but our department will not acknowledge that particular dog. Wait, what? I tried to object, but I was cut off. The operator had hung up the phone. At this point, I was more perplexed than ever. I'd never heard of animal control refusing to acknowledge a dog. What did that even mean? I turned back to the doorway to take another look at Shadow, but to my surprise, he was gone. I walked out onto the porch and looked as far as I could down both ends of the street. There was no sign of him. I wasted no time making my way to Frank's house. There was clearly more to this dog than Frank had initially let on. As I walked, I took notice of the houses I passed. Each and every one of them had their own set of bowls put out on the porch. It was like some sort of weird dog cult. Of course, Frank's house was no exception. There were a couple of shiny silver bowls set next to his front door. They even had Shadow's name etched into them in fine calligraphy. I rang the doorbell, and it didn't take long for Frank to answer. He greeted me with the same huge smile as before, but this time, I thought I detected some apprehension in his eyes. Hey Dave, to what do I owe the pleasure? I want to talk to you about Shadow, I said bluntly, not wasting any time. You told me he was a stray, but when I saw him just a few minutes ago, he was wearing a collar. Well, yeah, I guess that was a little misleading. You see, Shadow used to have owners. They abandoned him though, and now he just roams the neighborhood freely. Frank replied with an exaggerated shrug. Despite his outward demeanor, I could tell Frank was getting nervous. I pressed further. Who were these owners, and why won't animal control acknowledge Shadow? Frank's smile faded slightly. You called animal control? He asked. Well, I guess I owe you a bit more of an explanation then. Shadow's old owners were actually the Bennetts. Frank's inflection seemed to imply that I knew the Bennetts, so I told him that I had no idea who they were. The revelation visibly surprised Frank. But didn't you buy your house from them? I corrected him, telling them that I had purchased my house from the bank. As far as I had known, prior to my move, the house wasn't lived in. No, that's not right, he said, shaking his head. That house was lived in only a few months before you got there. The Bennetts were good people. They mostly kept to themselves. But they were good people. They had Shadow for a long time too. He was a puppy when they first adopted him. The Bennetts loved that dog, but then... Frank began to trail off before quickly catching himself. There came a point where taking care of Shadow became too much of a burden for them. It was a tough call, but they decided to take Shadow to a shelter. He was put into a cage, and they just left him there. After returning home, the Bennetts thought the matter was settled. However, later that night, they heard scratching on their front door. When they opened it, they were shocked to find Shadow sitting there staring back at them. "How did he get out of the cage?" I asked. That's the thing. No one working at the shelter saw it happen. Not only did he get out of the cage, but he also made it past 2 locked doors before starting a multi-mile trek back to the house. It doesn't stop there either. After Shadow returned, the Bennetts called animal control just like you. On 3 separate occasions, that dog was taken, and each consecutive night they found him again at their doorstep. Once again, no one could explain how this dog kept getting loose. Eventually the Bennetts just gave up and moved away, leaving Shadow behind. I took a moment to process what I had just heard. A million new questions formed in my head. Why hadn't anyone told me my house had prior owners? Why didn't they sell the house directly? If they loved Shadow so much, why did they abandon him? Unfortunately, before I had a chance to voice these queries, Frank gave me an ultimatum. "Listen, Dave, trust me when I tell you that you should just drop this. I understand that you probably have a lot of questions, but I promise you that you don't want to hear the answers. There are just some bells that can't be unrung. Please, for your own sake, just let this go." With that, Frank closed his door, leaving me alone and utterly baffled. Over the next few days, I began searching for answers in different places. It was obvious that Frank wouldn't help me anymore, so I turned to my other neighbors. On the street, at the grocery store, even at church. Anywhere I could stop and ask people about Shadow, I did. It seemed like everyone knew about Shadow, but no one wanted to talk about him. Despite the repeated warnings, my curiosity remained resolute. I was more determined than ever to find out the truth. I decided I would have to change up my tactics. If people wouldn't give me info about Shadow, maybe I could learn more from the dog himself. I set up camp next to the front window with a chair and a couple of books. I figured I would wait for Shadow to make another appearance on my block and follow him to see where he went. Luckily, I didn't have to wait very long. Around noon on the second day, I saw Shadow walk up a house across the street. This was my chance. I went outside onto my front porch and sat on the front steps. I waited impatiently for him to finish eating. I wanted answers. I wanted to know what made this dog so special. After what seemed like an eternity, Shadow finished his meal and started walking back towards the street. When he reached the curb, he noticed my presence. Once again, the dog just stared in absolute silence. His somber black eyes seemed to pierce through my very soul. I began to worry he wouldn't move, but he did eventually turn away. I kept my distance, trailing Shadow from the opposite side of the road. He walked with a clear sense of purpose, never stopping to sniff anything, and always keeping his attention fixed firmly ahead. I'd only ever seen other dogs behave like this in dog shows with people, never when they were on their own. We walked for about 15 minutes, and made our way to a part of the neighborhood I had never seen before. Shadow kept a steady pace throughout, so when he suddenly stopped, I was caught off guard. He walked over to a telephone pole and laid down at its base. From my viewpoint across the street, I could tell something else was at the base of the pole, but couldn't quite discern what it was. I needed to get a closer look. I slowly made my way towards him, and as I did, the other figure at the bottom of the pole became clearer. It was a large pink teddy bear. Time and the elements had worn its once vibrant coat into a dark, grimy mess. It was missing an eye, and some of its stuffing was falling out of its side. Shadow rested his head on the bear's lap. He noticed me approaching, but made no sign that he cared. The bear wasn't the only thing under the telephone pole either. Flowers in various states of decay were spread around the base, as well as some unlit candles. I knew what this was. I had seen far too many living in the city. I reached a point where I couldn't get any closer. I stood only a foot away from Shadow and the bear. That's when I saw it. Taped on the post was a picture of a young girl who looked maybe 8 or 9. There was writing on the top and bottom of the picture. It read, "Caroline Bennett will never be forgotten by her mother, her father, her friends, her community, or Shadow, the dog who never left her side." The pieces of the puzzle began to click in my mind. The Bennetts had a daughter. Shadow was Caroline's dog. This must have been why they no longer wanted him, because he was too painful a reminder of what they lost. Frank's actions made a bit more sense too now, though I still didn't agree with them. He wanted to shield me from the dark truth of the house I had just bought, the sad fate of its previous owners. I took another look at Shadow. He kept his head resting on the teddy bear's lap. but his eyes peered up at me. He gave me a look of deep sympathy, as if he understood what I was thinking. I returned to my house with a newfound respect for its history. The story of Shadow and the Bennett family was a tragic one, but I felt a certain peace of mind finally knowing the truth. I made my way through the next few days, gradually shifting my focus to other things. By the time a week passed, I felt as though I had returned to some semblance of normalcy. The illusion didn't last forever though. I was getting ready to go to bed one night around 11 when I heard a strange scuffling sound. It was coming from downstairs. I cautiously made my way to the top of the steps and listened. The scratching sound felt quiet. I wasn't completely sure, but I thought the source of the sound was outside. I tiptoed down the steps and looked out the peephole on my front door. Sure enough, there was Shadow waiting impatiently on the other side. I realized I had forgotten to put his bowl back outside after I refilled it that day. It was still sitting on my kitchen floor. I began to reach out for the handle but then stopped myself. I remembered Frank's warning from the very first day. Don't open the door at night. That warning was still a mystery to me, and I mostly chalked it up to Frank's overcautious manner in dealing with Shadow. I felt like I had gotten to know the dog at this point, and I had a certain level of trust that he wasn't dangerous. A reason that my anxiety wasn't warranted. Shadow was a good dog. I once again reached for the handle, turned it to the side, and opened the door. The instant I looked out onto the porch, I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't think, and I felt myself start shaking. I opened my mouth, but no sound would come out. It was too difficult to even breathe. I took a shaky breath of air and finally managed to choke out. Caroline? The specter stood beside Shadow. Her posture was unnatural. It was broken. Her shoulders rested at different heights, and her back was crooked. Her right ankle was cracked and faced almost completely behind her. Her neck bent sideways at an impossible angle, and her gaze was fixed on the floor. She only appeared to have one eye, and it was glazed in a creamy mist. She was wearing a pink dress, which was stained and worn with dirt and blood. A pale white light surrounded her body, and her presence chilled me to the bone. I didn't move. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare. Caroline lifted her head slowly to meet my gaze. When our eyes met, I didn't see hatred or anger. I saw sadness and fear. I saw a little girl who lost everything except for the dog that she loved. Caroline started to limp forward, and I just moved aside to let her pass me. Shadow trotted obediently beside her. The pair made their way into the kitchen, where I had left the food bowl. Shadow looked up to Caroline, and she nodded. He lowered his head to start eating. I just kept watching on from the front door. As Shadow ate, Caroline reached a gnarled hand down to stroke him behind the ear. I thought I even saw a faint smile across her face. I just stood there watching the pair with a sense of awe and sadness. When Shadow finished, Caroline again turned to face me. They made their way back to the front door without stopping or acknowledging me in any way. I watched them walk off the porch and onto the sidewalk. I closed the door behind them and looked out the window. Now, all I could see was Shadow, making his way back in the direction of the telephone pole. The dog really did never leave her side. I'm a plumber by trade. I'm based out of Big City, Texas, but I've always been willing to service the smaller communities out in the middle of nowhere. My mother raised me to help those in need, and a lot of these small towns have a tough time getting basic services like plumbing and electric work done due to their isolation. It was on a job a few years back, heading for Nowhere, Texas, that I experienced something that still haunts me. I got a call for work out in this town that was easily 200 miles away. I didn't even question the distance. The only issue was that the work needed to be done before the place opened up for business next day. Rather than leave at an ungodly hour, I chose to leave that evening and find a motel to crash at for the night. I had driven nearly the full distance when a storm hit, and it hit hard. The last sign I had passed said Nowhere was still 10 miles away. 10 miles on a dry day would have been no problem, but I was stuck in a monsoon. I slowed my truck to a crawl and puttered along the highway. After about 15 minutes, I noticed a light coming up on the right. It wasn't more than 20 or 30 feet from the road. I strained my eyes and realized there was a building standing there. The light came from the porch and seemed to be inviting me over. Not wanting to be out in this weather any longer, I pulled off and parked in front of the building. As I got out into the rain, I noticed that the building was a large house. It looked old too, like something from the Old West. The second thing I noticed was I wasn't alone. There was another truck parked in front of the house. Apparently, I wasn't the only one seeking shelter. I walked up to the porch, finding a respite from the rain. I raised my hand to knock, only to have the door creak open. An old Asian man stuck his face out, smiling with a mouth only half full of teeth. Looking for a room? I blinked a few times, unsure how he knew. The old man knocked on the front of the door, drawing my attention to it. In faded lettering, it said, "In." I couldn't believe my luck. "Yeah, I'm looking to get out of the storm." The old man stepped back. "Of course, come on in." I walked inside and let out a sigh as the storm was muffled. I looked around the entry. There were accents of red everywhere. Art on the wall suggested that the man might be Chinese. He was very proud of his culture. The house might have an Old West vibe on the outside, but the inside felt much more like the villas I'd seen in martial arts films. Nice decor, very traditional. The old man shut the door and walked over to a small desk. It's important to honor one's heritage and respect all that comes with it. He laid keys down on the desk and motioned to them. There are 4 rooms to choose from. Number 2 has already been taken. I looked at the numbers tied to each of them. 1, 3, 5, and 6. Odd. Is room 4 yours? The old man shook his head. I chose not to press the issue, not wanting to risk being kicked out. Okay, I guess I'll take number 1. The man bowed his head and took the other keys away. Will he put them away? I pulled out my wallet. How much do I owe you? The man looked up and shook his head. You are my guest. But if you are going to stay the night, you must follow the rule. I stared at the man for a few seconds, realizing he was serious. I chuckled nervously. If that's what it takes to stay dry, I'll do anything. Short of murder, that is. The man reached under the desk and produced a small scroll. I took it with a bemused smile. This guy sure was into the theatrics. I took it, unrolling it to read the rule. It was an old piece of parchment with only one rule written. Do not talk or open your door after midnight. I looked up to ask the man for clarity, but he was gone. I looked around, not seeing him anywhere in sight. I found myself rereading the rule, feeling more uneasy with the passing seconds. I proceeded upstairs to the rooms. As I got to the top of the stairs, I heard a door open. A portly man stepped out of a room and smiled. I thought I heard someone down there. He moved towards me and grabbed my hand. Good to meet you. The name's Earl. Carl. Not a bad setup here, right? Did that Chinese fella make you pay? I shook my head and Earl laughed. I don't know what his game is, but I won't turn down a free room. I held up the small scroll I'd been given. Did he give you the rule as well? That got Earl laughing even harder. I don't know what that's all about, but then he's an old fella. Well, I'll get eccentric at that age. Earl walked with me to my door. I noticed that the way the rooms were arranged placed the door to room 4 right in front of room 1. I couldn't help but look at it. Earl, did you ask about number 4 at all? Earl looked over his shoulder at the room. Yeah, I couldn't get an answer out of our friend downstairs. It's locked up tight anyway. He gave me a pat on the back. I'll leave you to it. If you need anything, just holler. I watched Earl walk back to his room and shut the door. I heard his lock turn and looked back at room 4 again. Maybe it was a storage room or something. It wasn't worth worrying about. I entered my own room and locked the door behind me. The room was small. There was only a bed and a nightstand with a lamp. I looked around for a bathroom, realizing that there might be an issue with my stay. And then I noticed a large pot in the corner. I was all for aesthetic, but this was pushing it a bit far in my opinion. I heard a knock on the wall. Earl's voice came through as if he were in the room with me. You got a piss pot too, right? I approached the wall inside. Yeah. Bastard couldn't spring for indoor plumbing. I looked at the wall and realized that I could see light coming between some of the boards. Not a lot, but enough to tell that Earl had his lamp lit. Thin walls, huh? I heard Earl chuckle. I don't mind if you don't, but be warned, I snore a bit. I smiled. I'll be just fine. I moved to the bed and sat down. I looked at the lamp, realizing it was an actual oil lamp. This old man really went all in for old-fashioned, didn't he? I emptied my pockets onto the nightstand, placing the scroll on top of everything. The rule ran through my head, sounding more ominous each time. I turned the lamp down until the flame extinguished. The light coming from Earl's room died down until it too was gone. I laid down in bed and settled in. After about 10 minutes, I began to hear Earl snoring. He wasn't kidding about it. The man sounded like a prize hog. I shook my head and pulled the sheet up to my chest. I just needed to try and sleep. It didn't take long for me to doze off, despite Earl. The next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of a jiggling noise. I opened my eyes, trying to find the source in the darkness. My eyes adjusted just enough to see that the handle on my door was moving. Someone was trying to get in. The rule rang through my head suddenly. Do not talk or open your door after midnight. I sat up in bed and checked my phone. It was a little after 2 a.m. My eyes turned to the door and watched as the handle jiggled again. I wanted to call out but stopped. Something felt wrong with the situation. Why wasn't the person asking for me? Was it the owner? Was he making sure we were complying with his rule? The handle stopped moving after a few seconds and was replaced by another noise. Whoever or whatever was out there was scratching at my door now. It was like a large cat was sharpening its claws on the wood. I covered my ears. What was happening? The scratching subsided after a minute or so. I slowly rose from bed and approached the door, being careful to be as quiet as possible. I got to the door and pressed my ear against the wood, and that's when I heard a soft, feminine whisper. "Won't you let me in?" I felt my blood run cold at the words. I wanted to answer but remembered the rule. Was this some sick game by the owner? "Please let me in. It's cold in my room." Part of me wanted to call the old man out for his bullshit, but I covered my mouth to keep from saying anything. Something in me was taking this seriously. The hairs on my neck were sticking straight out. I actually felt afraid of whatever was on the other side of this door. I stood there at the door for 5 minutes. Somehow, I knew my visitor was still there. After another few minutes, they seemed to lose interest. I felt a noticeable shift in temperature and my body began to relax. And then I heard the handle jiggle again. I looked down, but my hand was staying still. So where was Earl? I moved to the wall, trying to find a gap big enough to look through. No luck. Earl's snoring broke up as he was woken by the noise of the handle. What's that? I fought the urge to call out to Earl. Something in me screamed to not break the rule. I heard Earl sit up, get out of bed, and approach the door. He was still half asleep. "That you, Carl?" I waited for the scratching to start, but the voice came instead. "Won't you let me in?" I covered my mouth again, fighting every fiber of my being to warn Earl. I heard him answer the voice. "Huh? You don't sound like Carl." "Please let me in. It's cold in my room." "Your room? What room are you in?" "I'm from room 4. Any courage left in my body evaporated instantly, replaced by pure dread. I could feel the air getting colder again. A chill ran down my spine as I heard Earl fiddle with the lock. "Room 4? Shoot, I didn't know." I heard the door open. Anyone was... Earl fell silent. I heard a hissing noise and then a loud thud. The floor shook a little and I realized that Earl must have fallen over. I looked again for a crack in the wall. I finally found one near the floor. I peered through and saw Earl, his face frozen in a look of complete fear. He wasn't moving. It didn't take me long to realize that he wasn't breathing either. Earl was dead. And then I saw a pair of feet walk toward his body. They were as white as the sheets. I closed my eyes and moved away from the wall as quietly as I could. I crawled back into bed and covered my head with my pillow. It wasn't enough to block out the sound of bones being broken and flesh tearing apart. It wasn't enough to block out the sound of Earl being dragged across the floor and out into the hall. It wasn't enough to block out the sound of a door creaking open right outside my room. I began to sob into the pillow as the sound of a door shutting signaled the end of the horror. Earl's body had been taken to room 4. I laid there in bed for what felt like hours, crying for a man I had only just met. And then I heard a knock. I removed my pillow and stared at the door. Another knock. I didn't move. The knocking began again and didn't stop. It was like hearing a woodpecker on the trunk of a tree. Anyone would have instantly gone to see what the commotion was about. But I knew better. The knocking continued uninterrupted for several minutes. When it finally stopped, I let out the breath I'd been holding. "Won't you let me in?" I wanted to shout at the door, tell whoever it was to go away. I felt my lip tremble as I fought the words back. "Why won't you answer? I just want your help." I was starting to cry again. Whatever it was started banging on the door like a madman. "Help me." I covered my ears, waiting for it to end. I don't know how long the attack on my door went on for, but after what felt like an eternity, it finally subsided. I heard the door of room 4 slam shut. My nerves were shot, and I fell into a hazy half-sleep state until my alarm went off at 6. I made my bed and waited to see the first rays of sunlight through my window. As soon as that light hit my door, I unlocked it and turned the handle. The hall was empty. There was no signs of any sort of altercation, and no evidence of damage to my door. I looked down to room 2, wondering if maybe I had dreamt it all. Maybe Earl was still asleep in his bed. The silence in the hall stated otherwise. I couldn't hear Earl's god-awful snoring. I glanced at the door to room 4. It seemed undisturbed, just like I'd seen it last night. I left the inn immediately after that. I went to nowhere and did my work. The only reason I ever got near that inn again was because I had to go past it on the way home. But as I passed it, I realized the inn was boarded up. It was derelict, like it hadn't been occupied in decades, and Earl's truck was nowhere to be found. I kept driving, not wanting to give in to my curiosity, and even as the inn shrank in my rear view, I could feel something watching me from the window of room 4. My cousin was kind of a weird guy. I didn't see much of him despite living roughly in the same town. He had always lived out on a farm outside the city limits, but still in the same general area, despite his awkward behavior. Probably brought on by living so far from most people, he was a good person. He was also a damn good taxidermist, and I mean a damn good one. He picked up the hobby from going hunting with his father, and learning to stuff and mount bucks as trophies. He picked up the skill fast. My uncle was proud of him. I was proud of him. My cousin was an artist when it came to stuffing animals. Throughout high school, he made a good amount of cash doing taxidermy for hunters in the area. Some of his work still sits in the local hunting store as a testament to his skill and an old advert for his business. He's been missing for nearly a month now. We've lost hope that he'll be seen again. Since my aunt and uncle have passed, the duty of assorting his affairs have been placed on myself. So I took the time to go out to the old farm that has been in the family for generations, where my cousin had been raised and lived till his disappearance, where he also had a large garage set up for cleaning and stripping game, as well as taxidermy. I was the only person who saw him regularly when he was still around. Regularly for us meant about once a month. We'd usually just hunt or fish in some of the surrounding land. Besides the hunters who'd come by when wanting his service, he had no one else. His disappearance, while upsetting to most of the hunters, only held weight to me. He was my last living relative. Going back through the house felt a little surreal. The house itself like a ghost. Everyone who lived there was gone now, yet the photographs and furniture still sat. Grandpa's favorite chair, the aunt's old dolls that she collected still on shelves, the trophies my cousin and uncle had from hunting, still on the walls or standing in the corners. The place was dusty, but was just as it always had been, and I guess it was mine now. The workshop was barren when I entered. No tools or works in progress. It seemed that my cousin must have left it on his own accord, not letting anyone know, even me. It wasn't until later that week when I received a letter did I wonder. It was from Old Man Jacobs, who owned a local storage facility. It was addressed to myself, asking to come by and clean out the units my cousin had been renting. He seemed to express sympathy for my loss, while giving me as much time that I needed to swing by. I went the next day to go clear out the things left behind, figuring it was mostly old family mementos. I was a bit shocked when Mr. Jacobs told me there was 3 units. I didn't have a U-Haul or a pickup and would have to make multiple trips. The first unit was just as I expected. Old family furniture and boxes of photos. I took my time with these, looking back at photos of Grandpa and Grandma's wedding, my dad and uncle and some of their early birthdays. Being twins, it was hard to tell who was which. Ones of me and my cousin, back when things were better. Back when I still had a family. I had cleared it out, making sure to get everything. I even took the worn wardrobes back with me to the farm. I hadn't much use for the workshop, so I could store things there. I didn't sleep that night though. A heavy storm kept me up. I sat flipping through the family's albums again and again, while making space for them on a shelf. During the windy night, I heard a tapping. A branch from a bush under the window must have been hitting up against the house. Something I'd have to look at later. The following day, I made my way to the storage units first thing in the morning. The second unit was bound to be full of larger items. It sat next to the final unit, on the end of the row. When I finally got inside to look, it was a bit of a shock. From wall to wall, it was covered in various stuffed animals and pelts, from full bears and mountain lions, perfectly mounted buck heads, to boxes of small and large pelts. Some of them seemed familiar, like the buck that had been caught in the barbed wire a few years back. I remember that summer. We'd been out camping for the weekend, and when we got back, it was there, stuck in the barbed wire of the fence, tangled something awful. In its desperation, the buck managed to get a post out of the ground, then managed only to get more wrapped up in it. The thing must have been there for a day because it reeked. It had that rotting meat smell, gamey and putrid. Not much of the thing would have been useful, but I guess the head was intact enough for something. The other things I figured had minor imperfections or were to be sold online. He would post his stuff online from time to time when bills got overdue. Others would be marked by notes with prices and names. It wasn't unusual for a hunter to try and haggle after the item was made, either because they didn't have enough on them or didn't respect an artisan's craft. So some of these had been held for a later payment or to be sold to buyers able to pay their worth. From time to time, he'd donate some to nature museums. It was his form of charity. I knew I wouldn't be able to take all this stuff with me in my sedan, so I made a few calls, desperate to get the bigger items sorted. I sold them cheaply to the locals who hunted the animals. Figured if my cousin left them all here, then I could sell them for whatever I wanted. I loaded the boxes of pelts and hides in my car. Figured a bearskin rug and old cattle hide were too good to pass. The smaller things would just be sold later, or used for projects. After waiting hours on this one guy to show up and get his moose, I finally had the place emptied. Later, while back at the house, I had been so tired. I didn't want to mess around with the bushes, so I ordered a pizza and decided to browse the movie streaming services. I was about halfway through some show I'd put on to kill time, when it dawned on me, if my cousin did leave on his own accord, why did he leave all those stuffed animals unsold? Most people would sell them to make travel easier, or take them with them for examples in a new place. My thoughts got sidetracked when the pizza guy showed up. I tipped him an extra $10 for the distance and put on Old Boy. I remember falling asleep on the couch at some point, not being bothered to get up. Sometime in the night, I woke up to use the bathroom and heard that tapping noise again. I found it a bit strange considering it was a calm night. No wind or anything that could cause one of the branches on a bush to hit up against the house. I couldn't tell at the time if it was a possible animal in the trash cans, or just the old house making noise. In all honesty, I was too tired to want to investigate. Something so mundane. I would just get some better trash cans and have the place looked at later in the week, making sure the place is safe to live in and no animals can mess around in the trash. The third and final day of cleaning out my cousin's old storage was finally here. I was going to be glad when it was all over, and I could just continue with things as normal. I was a bit worried, however. The final storage unit was on the end of the row, and was larger than the others. It was one of those storage spaces with its own little side door you can open instead of always using the sliding one. I figured it would have been more stuffed animals, and boxes of horns and hides, that I'd have to try and contact people to sell, or take the things I didn't need. So when I got to the storage center, I was going to open the main door and just take photos of the stuff, go to a local pawn shop or the sporting store, and see if anyone was interested. I remember the events that actually transpired all too clearly. I opened the garage-style door and was greeted with a rancid odor. The hot, wet, gamey smell of a carcass filled the air around me. A smell like an animal had been killed and in the process of being skinned. The unit itself contained a human corpse laying on the ground, skinned and bare, collapsed in front of a perfect effigy of my cousin, dressed in his Sunday best, standing in a neutral position. The police ruled the murder of my cousin as suicide, despite the obvious flaws in the logic. A person can't skin themselves while making a near lifelike representation of them at their best. However, they saw a clear-cut case in the fact that he was skilled in taxidermy and was the only one known to have a key to the unit. I'm still fighting the system, demanding they look further into the case, then nothing at all. I can still hear the tapping, and I think I know what it is. It sounds a bit like a small metal object tapping against the glass of a window. It was early yesterday morning when I got up for work, earlier than usual. I hadn't slept much because I was so tightly wrapped around this case I've been working on. Serial killers. In the sewers. Crazy, I know, but we'd already found many bodies down there. It started when the lines backed up and a crew went down there to unclog the drains. It happens a lot in big cities. Grease from restaurants would wash down the drains and later cause big nasty clogs. Except it wasn't grease this time. My partner and I had been looking into this for months and I hadn't found any leads so far. Until later that same day, when a voice described best as nails on a chalkboard, if those nails had smoked for 30 years, if that makes sense, called in. She said she had an idea of what might be going on, and I jumped at the opportunity. She's probably just some nut who stares into the TV all night, Marissa. My partner Kellen had said, but I didn't care if that's all she was. Out of all the stations we had running our 24/7 number, she'd been the only person to call in 2 months. I rushed to her address after she insisted she was unable to come in and knocked on her door. Standing on her tacky porch made me start to rethink my decision, but I couldn't turn back when she stepped out. "You're Detective Riley?" She asked in that same voice I heard on the phone. "Marissa, please. Miss Stanley." I said before being ushered into the house. She offered me food, a drink, and even a cigarette, none of which I was interested in. She even led me to sit down, which I hesitated to do so. The house reeked, before finally getting down to business. "You said you may know something about who's down there, Miss Stanley?" I asked. Yeah, I do. I'm the only one who's seen them, and hasn't gone completely crazy." "Arguable." "Them? The ones in the sewer. They're horrible. You can get away from them if you don't look, if you just keep walking. But if you see them, you're a goner, unless you stay away from the water." She rasped out, coughing before she took a drink out of a questionable bottle. "I'm sorry, you've seen the people in the sewer?" I asked, trying to decide if this was worth my time. "Yes, a long time ago. Haven't gone in the water since. You can't once you've seen them, as if they let you go. If they want you to be with them." She made no sense and I quickly excused myself. The smell of her house suddenly made sense as I passed through the kitchen to leave. Upon taking a closer look, it was easy to see she'd stuffed rags in all of her drains. I made a mental note to call Adult Protective Services and headed back to the station. I can't bring myself to go into detail about what the rest of the day entailed, besides that it brought me and Kellen into the worst part of downtown. It had been a hot spot for murders lately, and we weren't far into questioning locals when we heard it. Someone calling for help. We followed the sound, and even called for backup as we realized it was coming from the manhole. Clumsily making our way down, we immediately drew our guns and called out for the person. The sound grew fainter before splitting off into 2 different people. "What if it's a trap?" I whispered. "Then we've got the upper hand, and help's on the way," Kellen replied, motioning he would check the sound to the right. I tried to be brave like him and ignore the smell as my heart pounded, and I made my way further in. It got darker, and I drew my flashlight, holding both it and my gun with difficulty. I called out for the person but got no response besides more quiet pleas for help. Scared that someone was bleeding to death, I hurried further and further in. The darker it got, the more the smell changed from sewer to rotting meat. and I thought briefly of turning around. "You can turn around," a voice said from behind me, the same one that called for help. I jumped and dropped my flashlight, nearly shooting myself as I bent to pick it up quickly. "Yes, turn around." "You have to want to turn around," more voices echoed. They grew louder, and I was frozen in place, hearing only one voice in my head at the moment. "You can get away from them if you don't look, if you just keep walking." And that's what I did. Almost as if I was on autopilot, my legs started carrying me further in, and the voices followed. "Look at us," they'd say in that haunting tone that seemed to echo off the tunnels. "You want to look now." It continued, and I tried not to have a panic attack. Tried to keep looking for a way out. It wasn't the first time we'd been down here, and I'd seen where the tunnels would intersect, and there'd be 3 or 4 manholes just in one place. Alternating between holding my breath and hyperventilating, I kept my eyes up or in front of me, but never behind me. I thought I knew panic in the continuous walk that may have taken hours, or in listening to the voices constantly chanting behind me, but I learned we were only acquainted when I reached the dead end. "Yes," several of them laughed. "Look, look," another screamed. "Just look at us. You want to look." I shut my eyes tightly and tried to make this a dream, letting out my own screams of hopelessness. Then after what felt like an eternity of staring at the wall, I turned around. Only to wake up in my bed, drenched in sweat and screaming my head off. My apartment was small and I heard banging on the wall next door to let me know the screaming wasn't appreciated, but I didn't care. Upon closer inspection, I found that I was clothed in my usual nightwear, a t-shirt and panties. Not my work clothes or belt or anything soaked in sewer water. And although I didn't remember going to bed last night, it didn't matter. I was home, and it had all been a dream. Encouraged by the rantings of that crazy woman, no doubt. I stood in disbelief for only a moment before making my way into the bathroom and rushing to get in the shower. Even if I hadn't actually been in the sewer, I still felt gross. The water rushed over me, and it felt good, safe, and warm. I shut my eyes and listened to it hitting the wall. They shot wide open when the whispering started. I cut the water off immediately and jumped out. "We know you can hear us. We're one now, because you looked. You saw us in the water. Now you'll see us every day," he continued. And I remembered their horrible mangled faces, dripping with water and blood, their teeth and bones jutting out at awkward angles. "Soon we'll be in everyone's water, in everyone's mind. Because you looked. It's been so long since someone looked, since someone let us in," they whispered. And that's why I'm writing this. I don't know how long I'll have. I've tried to stay away from the drains, but I've drank everything in the fridge. I don't feel safe leaving. I don't feel safe anywhere, because it's not safe. It's not safe to look at them. Not even in your own mind. Not anymore. They're in the water. It was 7 a.m. We were woken by the sounds of chirping birds and heavy rain. Today marked the first day of summer camp. I wasn't ready to start the day yet. My sleep schedule consisted of not going to bed until 5 in the morning and not waking up until 2 in the afternoon. I went outside and ran outside and into the main building with all the other campers. I walked in with my clothes soaked from the rain. All the counselors were there too. "Attention everyone," yelled one of the counselors. "Today's the first day of summer camp," they exclaimed. The only response was the silence that came from the campers. You could tell how ecstatic everyone was. So the first thing I'm going to go over is the camp rules. Rule 1 is no going out of your sleeping cabin past 10 p.m. unless instructed to stay outside. Rule 2 is no bullying any other campers. We won't tolerate it. Step 3 is not exploring past the campgrounds unless you're with a counselor. "Why?" said one of the campers. "Is it too scary for the campers?" he said in a sarcastic voice. "You don't want to find out," said one counselor. "Anyways, let's carry on with our first day." The whole day we went canoeing, fishing, and archery. Later that night, they had a campfire outside with hot dogs and s'mores. It was almost 10, so that would mean the campers would have to go to bed soon. "Attention campers, it's almost time for bed. Please be in your cabin beds within the next 10 minutes. Thank you, said a counselor. I was walking back to my cabin when a kid ran out in front of me and asked me to go beyond the campgrounds with him. It was a kid from earlier that was making fun of the rules. His name was Michael. He was with one other kid. He didn't talk much, but his name was Josh. I was debating if I should go or not, but I got curious and wanted to explore. We made sure nobody was looking, and we ran into the woods. We checked back to make sure nobody followed us. We walked for a while until we found a small shed hidden behind some trees. Let's go in, said Michael. I don't know if we should, said Josh. I don't get good vibes from this place. Ah, you're too scared to go inside? Josh stared at him for a minute or so, then he proceeded to say, lead the way. We walked over to the shed. We couldn't see an entrance in the dark, but Michael pulled out a flashlight, and we found the door. We walked into the building, and we were hit with an extreme stench of rotten garbage. We looked at the ground, and saw a large group of corpses piled on top of one another. I wanted to throw out my stomach because of how disgusting it was. My stomach churned and twisted as we saw the bodies. Michael yelled at us to leave, so we ran out the door. As we were running, we saw a dark figure standing there. We stopped in our tracks and stared at it. Michael pulled out his flashlight and pointed at the figure. As we looked at the figure, my whole body shook. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. The figure was a man. He seemed to be about 6 feet tall. He was broad-shouldered and buff. He had a smiley face mask on. The mask itself wasn't scary. It was just unsettling. The mask seemed to be covered in something. I could only assume it was blood. We exchanged stares for a few minutes. He started walking towards us quite fast, so we started walking away. He pulled out a machete from behind his back and started running at us. Michael dropped his flashlight, and my only instinct was to run. I ran like I never had before. I looked behind me, only to see the man running right for me. Michael and Josh were running right next to me. As we were running, Michael's tripped on a tree root. As I was about to help him, the man ran out from the trees and was right next to me. I couldn't save Michael, so I had to run. I ran and ran until I found the cabins. I didn't decide to look back till I reached the cabin. Josh was with me. We were both tired and out of breath. We ran to the cabin the counselors were in and told them what happened. They called the police, and they asked us a few questions. We told them we found a shed in the woods with corpses, and we told them that Michael was the only one who didn't make it. We led the police to the shed. As we walked in, no smell hit us. There were no bodies on the ground, and there was no evidence of anything. We thought we may have just been imagining it. We thought the corpses didn't exist, the man didn't exist, and we thought Michael didn't even exist. Later that night, Josh and I were in the cabin getting ready to fall asleep. We heard a knock on the cabin door, and thought it was a counselor checking on us. Josh opened the door, only to see the man with the smiley face mask standing right in front of him. I was walking home from work and needed to grab something to eat before I headed home. I was so hungry that I just walked into the nearest restaurant on the street. I don't think I had ever been in there before, at least not that I could remember. The door slammed behind me, and a strong wave of fried food hit me all at once. The layout was spacious. Booths lined either side of the space, and there was a clear path to a counter at the farthest end of the restaurant. It seemed to be miles away from the entrance. Above it looked to be a menu. I walked over to it and saw that they sold fish and chips. There was no one at the counter though, so I stood around and waited a minute before deciding to just take a seat in one of the booths. It was cold outside, and the warmth of the restaurant began to settle in my skin. I took my jacket off and brought out my phone, but it was suddenly dead. It was working not that long ago, so I thought that was really weird. I put it back in my pocket. So I just sat there, listening to the repetitive techno music coming from the restaurant speakers. The atmosphere honestly felt overwhelmingly eerie. I kept peering over my shoulder to see if anyone was at the counter, but every time I did, it was still vacant. I thought for a moment that maybe the place was actually closed, but why would all the lights be on if it was? Plus the door was unlocked, and the music was droning on in the background. About 10 minutes went by and I was still alone. I started getting a bit uncomfortable. I was also super tired from my shift at work and just wanted something to eat. As I sat there, I eyed the place a little more. I realized how awful the paint job was. The walls were a dull shade of yellow, littered with a variety of vintage music posters. Taking everything in, I eventually noticed that my bladder was on the verge of bursting. I searched the room for any sign of a bathroom. There seemed to be an open door on the opposite side of my booth, which looked like it was leading to a basement. The entrance was facing the direction of the counter, so I couldn't see for sure. I got out of my seat and walked toward the doorway. It had a wood sign above it that said, "Washroom" on it, and sure enough, there was a stairwell. I noticed a dim purple light coming from around the corner of the bottom of the stairs. The steps themselves were steep, so I made sure to hold on to the railing as I went down. It was sticky, gross, and cold. When I reached the landing, I saw where the light was coming from. There was a neon sign in the shape of a fish, hanging on the wall in the middle of two doors, marked with gender-neutral symbols. I got a sudden feeling of unease right as I was about to open the bathroom door. I really don't know what came over me, but it went away just as quick as I started to feel it. Once I had finished my business, I left the bathroom and made my way back up to the dining area. I immediately had to hold on to the railing going up as well. Felt a bit lightheaded, and I figured it was probably from not eating. There was still no one I could see. I combed the room for a clock. There was one above the counter. It said it was just past 10 o'clock. I decided to finally try asking if anyone was there. I walked right up to the counter and leaned over it as much as I could to see if I could spot anyone behind it. I had a thought that maybe whoever was there was on some kind of work break. "Hello? Can I get some service, please?" I tried to keep my volume pretty low, but my voice still seemed to have a faint echo. There was no answer, so I tried to speak up again, but I was interrupted by the bell above the entrance. Something I didn't notice when I came in. I turned around, hoping it was someone who could actually give me some service, but no one was there. A gust of wind came through the restaurant, and my heartbeat sped up a little bit. I suddenly felt anxious being in this place alone. I remember my entire body shivering from the cold air that came in. I was gripping the counter behind me. I didn't even know why I felt so scared. My eyes darted around the room. I began feeling slightly dizzy and lightheaded again. The obnoxious techno music continued to play, but it sounded further away now. Everything felt farther away, like I was underwater or something. I was suddenly startled by a small voice. There were quiet meows coming from my feet. I looked down and saw a black cat getting ready to rub its body against my legs. In a split second, my anxiety and fogginess disappeared as if it was never there in the first place. I knelt down and pet the creature. I could tell that it was purring. I picked it up because I wanted to get a better look at it and to see if it belonged to anyone. I stood up, still holding it in my hands. "Where did you come from?" I whispered. The little cat sneezed. I let out a laugh. As I was about to put it back on the floor, I noticed that it began shaking. I thought it might have been cold, but the shaking didn't stop. It was vigorous. I wanted to get it out of my hands, but it was moving so much I didn't know what to do. Without warning, the cat burst into black flames, letting out a wounded screech. Then right before my eyes, the cat-shaped flame started to morph into something else. What's weird is that the flames didn't burn me. They barely felt hot at all. I threw the burning cat away from me and stumbled towards the exit. The closer I got to reaching the door, the farther away it seemed to become. It was like I was running in place, and in slow motion. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't go where I wanted to. I was stuck. Still struggling, I looked over my shoulder, scared of what I might see behind me. I could see a shadow-like figure. My heart fell into my stomach. A wave of pure fear came over me, and all I wanted to do was scream, but I couldn't. I tried. I turned my head back to the door. I still couldn't get to it. I then felt a hand on my shoulder. The shadow figure's head crept up beside me, revealing a gruesome smile that will forever be ingrained in my head. The lights in the restaurant started to flicker. I gasped for air, and everything went black. Sometime later, I was woken up by a voice I didn't recognize. I opened my eyes and saw a man I also didn't recognize. He asked if I was okay. "Hey kid, you alright? Do you want me to call someone for you?" I was laying on my back on the floor. Overhead lights were blinding me, so I sat up. My head was pounding and I didn't know where I was at first. But that fried food smell reminded me. After a quick panic attack on my part, the man explained that he found me knocked out in the middle of his restaurant when he came out of the staff room. He thought I was just passed out drunk at first, but when I didn't respond to him, he started to worry. Apparently I woke up right before he was about to call the police. I never told that man what really happened to me, because I wasn't sure if he would believe me. I honestly haven't told anyone, but I know what I saw and experienced. It's something I'll never forget. I went home that night and didn't sleep at all. I actually had trouble sleeping for weeks after that. Sometimes I still get nightmares. I don't have a real explanation for what happened that night in that random fish and chips restaurant. I just know that something is terribly wrong with that place, and I'll never be able to look at black cats again without seeing that horrendous, shadowy face.
Number 1. Shadow. I have had problems with sleep paralysis in the past. I think that I noticed that many people who probably have it often also tend to get migraines and things of that nature. And I have problems with those too. But even though sleep paralysis is generally always a little unsettling, it has become something that I've definitely gotten used to. The majority of the times that it occurs, I'm able to simply dismiss it afterwards. This was about 5 years ago. It was long before I knew that horror narration channels told stories of sleep paralysis. I've since wanted to tell one of my own stories, but I've mostly found sharing such personal accounts wasn't something that I ever really became comfortable with. I decided to share this one because it is a little different than my usual experiences. I was headed back to my house after I had gotten out of work. I had felt the familiar sickness in my stomach that came with the onset of a migraine. Therefore I knew that I wasn't going to have that great of a night. I mainly was concerned with getting home as quickly as I could and getting to bed. Getting home quickly was easier said than done, as it had begun snowing about an hour or so before I got enough work. The first big snow in the area is always a difficult situation, so all the cars were driving slow and being careful. And please don't get me wrong, as I'm not disparaging people for doing that. It is absolutely the smart and safe thing to do. But by the time I got home, I was so miserable. I finally got home and I took some medication and went to lay down in my bed. I lived in a house alone, inherited from my parents. It was formerly a funeral home, but when my parents passed, I did not continue their business. I got in bed and I tried to sleep. I was nearly blind from the migraine. I had trouble falling asleep, and at one point I woke up and saw something in my room. The bedroom door was open just a little bit, and standing in front of the door was a shadow. I was not scared though. As I mentioned, I have sleep paralysis and hallucinations every now and then as part of a partial seizure. It was not unusual for me to see something, but I was confused because I always slept with the door closed. I passed out and later woke up again. This time my door had been closed. I was not able to process everything very much, so I just fell back asleep. I didn't think much about this until the next morning. When I felt better and woke up, I noticed several things. My safe was broken into. My gun was taken out of it. Knives were missing from my knife block in the kitchen. I mentioned the house being a funeral home, because my dad had installed security cameras. I kept them when I got the house. When I reviewed them, I was absolutely terrified. A very large man wearing a mask had broken into my house. At one point, with a cleaver in his hand, he walked into my bedroom. He was the shadow that I had seen, and he had a scary knife in his hand. He had been standing in my room with me for at least an hour. At one point, he even approached the bed, but he did not do anything to me. He left and closed the door. The only thing he took was weapons. I have no idea why he didn't take money or anything else like that. My gun was used in an attempted murder several days later. Fortunately, the victim survived, but the fact that someone had stolen my gun and attempted a murder was beyond terrifying to me. Number 2. Troll. This is a weird story. It is more from my perspective, but it happened to my younger brother. We lived in the country. The bus that would take us to school did not come down our road, so in the morning we had to take a long walk to a bus stop. And along that walk, there was a small, covered bridge. I had graduated from high school. My younger brother was 11 at the time. After I graduated, he had to start walking to the bus stop on his own. I think nowadays it would be weird to have such a young kid walking by himself that long in the early morning. Very often he would begin when it was dark outside, and after a few weeks of walking by himself, he told my mom that he was scared. He told her that there was a troll under the covered bridge. My mom was only mildly concerned about what he said. She figured, of course, that my brother was just scared of the dark and walking to school alone. She did what I think any mother may have done in that instance, and told him there was no such thing as trolls. If he sees something weird, he should not be scared of it. The second part of the advice was not good in my opinion. Fear is an important thing, as it protects us from danger, so I wasn't sure why my mom felt that way. It actually turned out to be bad advice. A few days later, my brother Cole did not come home from school. We figured the bus was just late, but a few hours passed and he didn't show up. We called the school and they told us that Cole had never arrived to school that day. So at that point we had to call the police. That was a pain because of how far out in the country we lived. It took quite a while for the police to get there, and it was dark by that point. So the police went searching for Cole. It was an agonizing time. I really loved my little brother, and I began cursing myself for not walking with him. Even to this day, I know I share a lot of blame for what happened. I'm writing this story specifically for Killer Orange Cat because I know he lost his older brother last year. During the search, I was certain that my brother was dead, and it was very hard. I cannot tell you how much I cried because I thought I would never see my sweet and kind little brother again. The feeling of loss was heavy. It took until after midnight for the police to have found my little brother, and he was near death when they found him. He was in the creek and he was hurt badly. I don't want to go into details about what had happened to him because that is really hard to talk about. But just imagine the worst thing that could happen to a kid that age, and you'll be able to figure it out. When Cole got better, he was able to tell us what happened. He had been walking to school and came to the bridge. He was very scared to cross it. A hermit was living under the bridge. He had been there for a long time, and he was gross and nasty looking. That was why Cole thought he was the troll. Cole went over to the side of the bridge, and that is when he saw the man. He convinced himself that he should not be scared of the troll, and he actually approached the man. Well, that was a huge mistake. The guy was a pervert, and he forced himself onto my 11-year-old brother under that bridge. He was rough with him, and afterwards dumped him into the water of the creek away from the bridge. The police found him. He had moved to an old abandoned shed. He of course went to jail. Cole was a mess afterwards. I cannot even tell you how bad he was. I began walking him to the bus after that. Number 3. Knocking. This is a very weird story and I'm not sure what to make of it. About 2 weeks ago I was sleeping in my bedroom. When I woke up, I noticed that I had a message on my Discord from my sister. People who follow me closely know that my sister and I share a home. Well, my sister, me, 8 cats, and a collie. Anyway, she asked if I locked myself out of the house. You see, sometimes I will actually leave out the bedroom window. I do this because of an episode of Seinfeld, actually. George claimed he went out the window to get coffee because the door was farther away. Anyway, again, I found her question to be weird. And not weird because we live in the same house and we send Discord messages to each other. And not weird because we live in the same house and we send Discord messages to each other. Weird because I had not been out of the house for over a day. But she assumed I locked myself out and crawled into my bedroom window. I told her I didn't. I then asked why she was asking. It turns out that right before she sent me the message, someone tried to turn the doorknob on our front door. They jiggled it as if trying to get in. The collie was whimpering. Eventually they stopped. She thought it was me and that I did not want to knock on the door because I didn't want to wake her up. I didn't think much of it really. I remember that this happened right before we were going to go see a movie. We were worried about leaving the house alone. Also, my sister and I enjoy keeping the house dark. We have always been like that. We do not have a car, so it would appear that no one was home. About 4 months ago, a drug dealer that was friends with my brother tried to break into our home. He actually opened one of my bedroom windows and almost took the screen out. Finally, he left when he saw the 4-foot sword we have in our home. Due to this incident, I bought a stun gun. Well, tonight, my sister was sleeping, and suddenly our dog began barking wildly. Buffy barks a lot, but there was a tone in this bark that concerned me. I put on my slippers and came to the living room. My sister told me that again, someone turned the doorknob, trying to get into the house. Well, I took the stun gun and went out in my slippers. I looked around the front, side, and backyards. I saw no one. But I called out loud that if the bastard could hear me, he'd better never do it again, or I will stick the stun gun up his ass and give him the shock of his damn life. I then came into the house to make cookies, and no, I'm not trying to be funny here, I actually did this. While the cookies were cooling, I decided to go and stand on the front porch. Across the street, my neighbor's house was dark. He had a lot of things stacked on his porch. Suddenly, I heard the things on the porch moving for about 15 seconds and then it quit. And no, this was not a dog or a cat. The noises were being made by someone big, and I have every right to believe it was a person. Now, there could be an easy explanation to this. Behind my house, there's a house that is being sold. When the occupants left, they left the door unlocked. I truly believe people were squatting in the house. So what does this have to do with the story? My house was repaired several weeks ago, and it was locked up. So, was there a person under that junk? I believe there was. I believe that people were squatting in that house, and once it was locked up, tried to get into our house. Our dog probably scared them away. And then I think they were trying to keep warm under the junk on the porch of my neighbor's house across the street. I'm sorry if this doesn't scare anybody, but try to put yourself in my shoes. Somebody coming up to your house, not knocking on the door, just grabbing your doorknob and trying to get in. Somebody who does that cannot have good intentions.
This is a story I heard from my friend Kay at a university. A man got whiplash in a car accident and decided to convalesce at home for a week. Kay was married, But his wife was also working, so he was all alone during the day. For the first few days, he enjoyed the freedom, but when the third day came, boredom began to set in. Still, he had to stay in because of his injury. Then one day, past lunchtime, he was watching TV absent-mindedly when he heard heavy stamping noises and children's voices from upstairs. He didn't pay much attention to it, although he wondered if they were on a school holiday. The next day began, and again he heard the same children's voices around the same time as the previous day. It sounded like there were 2 children up there. The place where Kay lived was a large apartment block, but in spite of that, it tended to be very quiet during the day. The children's voices, therefore, echoed loudly in contrast to the quietness of the surrounding. Kay, however, did not feel annoyed, but was rather glad of the distraction and a break it gave him from the eerie silence. The next day, Kay, feeling bored and not motivated enough to cook lunch, ordered some pizza. The pizza, which arrived within 30 minutes, turned out to be too much for Kay that he left one whole pizza untouched. Usually, he would keep any leftovers for his wife, but this time, he remembered about the children upstairs and, willing to do something kind, he decided to take the pizza to them. Kay had no idea who the occupants of the room upstairs were, but rang the bell on the door anyway. He heard something stir inside, but there was no answer. He rang the bell again. He felt someone was looking at him through the peephole. "Who is it?" a faint voice called out from behind the door. Kay explained he was from the room below and that he had some pizza left over from his lunch and wondered if they wanted it. The door opened a crack. It looked unusually dark inside the room. From the gap, about 5 centimeters wide, a woman appeared, revealing only half of her face. "Thank you very much, but we don't want it," the woman said coldly. It was a little too dark to discern her facial expression. Kay suddenly felt he was somehow out of place, like he shouldn't be there. However, he tried to explain to her that he wanted her to give the pizza to the children. A lukewarm air breezed out of the door. He smelled an unpleasant odor. In an instant, 2 children's faces lined up below the woman's face. The door was open still, just a crack. The dull eyes of the children stared at him. The 3 faces were forming a line. "I see. Then I will accept your kindness," the woman said. When Kay put the pizza box through the gap, a hand reached out right from the side and snatched it away. The 3 faces were still staring at Kay. "Thank you," he heard the faint voice again. Kay quickly left the place. He felt spooked. In the corner of his mind, he sensed something was seriously wrong. The image of the children's faces had left a burning impression in his mind. Faces. He felt a chill down his spine. Faces? They were forming a line. His pace quickened. He wanted to get away as fast as he could. He waited for the lift, but it would not arrive. Forming a line. Vertically. On top of each other? He pressed the button again and again. But the lift still did not come. He turned to the emergency stairs. His head throbbed with pain. He began to feel nausea. Just as he opened the heavy door leading to the emergency stairs, he felt eyes on his back. Turning around, he glimpsed, about 10 meters from him, the same 3 faces looking at him from the corner of the corridor, like before. They were showing only half of their faces and staring at him with their dull eyes. The cold daylight shining through the windows illuminated their faces. No longer caring about his neck, he frantically ran down the stairs. Although the health-conscious Kay often used the stairs instead of the lift and could even run up 4 floors in one go, He felt as if no matter how fast he ran, he would never reach the ground floor. Faces lined up, on top of each other. That's impossible. That means there are no bodies. And the strange things I saw behind the faces were hands holding up their heads. He ran into the nearest convenience store and asked people to call the police. The police came and searched the flat and found the bodies of the mother and children in a bathtub. These bodies were headless. According to their findings, it had been 3 days since the heads had been chopped off the bodies. And the husband, who turned out to be the murderer, was found hiding in the wardrobe insane. He insisted his family was still alive. There was a terror in his eyes. The police did not know the source of his terror, though.
Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. First I want to thank everyone who's been part of Dracula, and everyone who has enjoyed it. I have loved the positive response it had. The original recording that I was going to use was over a 2 gigabyte file. It was because I edited it over and over again. I really hope the hard work showed. A lot of people had a really positive response to the thumbnail that my sister made, where she made Ichigo look like Gary Oldman's Dracula. If you check the description of the Dracula video, there is actually a t-shirt that she did through the Represent company, and if anybody would like that, again, my sister handles all the merchandise. I don't make money off it. I just let her do it. It's her thing. If anybody wants the shirt or they just want to look at it, look in the description. There's a link. It's pretty good. Now, on Black Friday, I will be doing a live stream. If any narrators want to join me, please let me know. Hopefully I will have several videos out this week as well. My good buddies, the Grimtail brothers, have been very patient with me, as have all of my subscribers. I will have a few stories narrated by my friends up soon. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, feel free to click the subscribe button and the bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment and share this with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. And if anybody understands